Welcome back. Today on the Woodgrafter we're going to make a classic end grain cutting board out of maple and cherry. That sounds good. Stick around. Hi and welcome to the Woodgrafter. I'm Andy Gale. If this is your first time here, welcome on board. Our mission is to inspire, educate and support you in your journey to becoming a better woodworker. We do that through a whole series of videos. We do tool tips, tool techniques, setup, reviews, news from the industry. We do project videos such as this one. We also have a website, www.thewoodgrafter.com, and over there you're going to find detailed build project courses, a vibrant community and plans so you can build along if you wish. This design will give you that cutting board 400mm long, 300mm wide and 30mm thick. It's made up of cherry and it's made up of maple. And here's the material I'm going to use. First thing we need to do is to cut these boards to a length of round about 800mm long. We're then going to need 5 widths of cherry, 20mm thick, 30mm wide, and 5 lengths of maple, again 20mm thick and 30mm wide. So a board of just over 150mm wide, 800mm is what we initially want. Now this piece of cherry is 230mm wide and the maple I've got available is 150mm wide. So one length of the cherry is going to be great, but I'll need 2 lengths of this because that's a little bit too tight for what we're trying to achieve. To cut this to length, we'll use the Capex. So there's our 3 boards cut. You see we've got 2 maple, 1 cherry. The next job is to bring these down to a uniformed 20mm thickness. For that we'll use the planer jointer. And there we go, 3 pieces of wood all cleaned up. Cherry, maple, maple, whatever the width is, but more importantly all 20mm thick and just over 800mm long to allow us to work. Now the next job is I want to rip these to 30mm strips. I'm actually going to rip them down to about 32mm strips and I'm looking for 5 of each piece of material. Now the reason I want to bring this down to 32mm is I can then reuse the planer jointer to bring them down to that final 30mm thickness I'm looking for, and then that's going to give me a really good joint when we come to glue these up. Table saw, 32mm, let's get ripping. So there you go, after a bit of work we now have a whole host of timber all milled down and jointed ready for the glue up. These are now all 20mm thick and they're 30mm wide. And you can see what we're trying to achieve. Maple, cherry, maple, cherry, maple, cherry, maple, cherry, maple, cherry, and a spare piece of maple. And lining those up, that's the glue what we're going to go for. And obviously each of these joints has got to be super tight. Now the other thing to remember, of course, is that these are oversized. Deliberately so. We need a length of 800 and we've currently got a length of 900, so 800 is going to sit somewhere in the middle. Always worthwhile checking your joints at this stage. If you can bring the joints together at hand pressure like that and get a good joint out of that, you're in a good shape. So now it's simply a matter of gluing these up. This spare piece I've got here, I'm just going to cut it down so it's ever so slightly shorter than my overall width, and I can then just use that as a bit of a caul on the end just to make sure that all these things sit as flush as I can possibly make them. So I've loosely laid these out for the glue up, and to actually do the glue up I'll turn each of these towards me like so. Now I'm only going to put glue on one face, glue on the face, bring it up, glue on the face, bring it up. So I need to make sure that this has got a lot of glue on it. So I don't want to starve these joints. The last thing I want to do is the board to start to separate. In use, now I'm going to use Titebond 3, Titebond 2 will do as well. It's important that when you're using the glue, it's got this FDA approved food contact mark here on the label. Non-toxic, FDA approved for indirect food contact, which is exactly what this is going to do. Titebond 2 and Titebond 3 are both good for the job. I like Titebond 3 because it's waterproof to quite a high grade, and this will get water on it, so that's great. And also it gives me a longer opening time. And it's my standard glue that I use, Titebond 3, so nothing new there. As always, I'm going to use a brush to apply this, so I'll go ahead, put glue on these joints, bring it together, and then put a light bit of clamping, and we'll look at leveling this thing up. Let's get that first job done. Make sure you get loads of glue on these ends, because don't forget this is an end grain board and you don't want those end grain joints separating on you. I just give it this nice coat. Normally I go for translucent on my glue ups, we've spoken about that before, but on this particular one I want it slightly darker than translucent because I'm only gluing one surface. You could glue both surfaces, but obviously in doing that it gets rather messy. So you can see that's really coated well, really coated well. I'm going to get the world's worst squeeze out, but that's okay. It's more important that I don't have these joints starved. Just going to use a couple of cauls just to straighten this up as much as I can with the ends, like so, and then loosely clamp up the board. Okay. Not too tight at all at this time. Now I'm just coming in with these cauls that we cut earlier on. I'm just going to give them a quick coat of wax, and this is purely so they don't stick to the board, and then I can lie one on the top and just clamp one underneath as well. Now what this is going to do is just going to level out these boards for me and just make sure that everything is as flat as it can be. Really tighten down on these. I want that really quite tight. Okay, now that will give you a nice level surface, and with that done we can now come in with these clamps and just begin to put pressure across the board. Just want to make sure that these middle boards are lying flat, so just to persuade them in. And now we just leave this to dry overnight. Just get rid of the glue, squeeze out a little bit, make life easier on the next stage. Okay, and now we can put that on one side to dry. So I'll let this dry off now overnight, good sort of 7 or 8 hours. Then we'll come back in and we've got to flatten it down, and then we can look at the next stage. See you in a minute. And there you have it. You take your board out of the clamps and this is what you end up with. A nice striped piece of timber. Got some work to do, got to level the surface, take the glue off, cut it down to overall size, but you can see the step one is pretty much done. If you wanted to, you could actually stop at this step and you've got yourself a long grain cutting board. You probably want it to be a bit thicker. This is 20mm. You probably want to be about 30, maybe even 40mm to give you a bit of substance behind it. But yeah, cut that in half, 2 cutting boards. Job's a good one. But that's not what we're after. We're after an end grain cutting board. So we've got some more work to do. Now the next big job is we now need to cut this into strips. Then we bring the strips on end, exposing the end grain, and glue them together. Then that gives us a shorter, thicker board with the end grain exposed. So we've got to prepare this surface now so it's joinery ready, i.e. it's got to be flat, so when these come up they mate together in a seamless way with no gaps in the glue joint. Now the obvious way of doing that in a small workshop is with our planer jointer. You could sand this, you could hand sand it, but then I think you're going to get slight undulations in the board that will give you gaps in the board when you glue it together. Now I've made a mistake here. The width of my board currently is 300 millimeters, and that's what I designed it for. However, the width of my planer is 25 millimeters. So I want to bring this board down now to 25 millimeters. But when I put this together, I still want that checked pattern. So I can't just take it all off one side. I want to come in equal lengths. And I've done a bit of measuring, and I need a 7mm strip here inside this maple and a 7mm strip here inside this cherry to give me that 25 that will then fit through my planer jointer, giving me a good jointed surface. So my next job is I want to bring this down to size. I'm just going to take off this glue run before I do that so it's out of the way. Easiest way of doing that at this stage is with a scraper. I'm just clamping the board between a couple of dogs and a surface clamp just to give it a little bit of stability. Coming in with rather a flexible scraper and then starting at one end, flex the scraper away from you, and that glue will just pretty easily clean off the surface. As I say, doing it with a card scraper, make sure you don't tear out the surface. Now in terms of bringing this down to its final size, you could obviously take it to the table saw. What I think I'm going to do is use the track saw. So I'm just going to come in first of all and give myself a clean end at both ends of the board, and then I can use that as a reference face against the fence here, and then I can rip this to length on the track saw. Now the reason that I am going for the track saw for this particular job is to help avoid tear out. Now think about the way the track saw works. I've got a zero clearance cut in the table itself which supports the underside of the material. I've got the plastic strip on the fence that avoids tear out, and I can also use the green foot on the TS55 to avoid tear out. So I can protect all areas of the board, helping reduce that tear out. Simply a matter of lining the board up, coming in here at the end, so the board is just, so the lowest part of the board, which is that piece here on our board, is exposed. We know that's a good surface because we did it in the planer jointer before, so I can reference that against my fence, and then just put a little bit of clamping pressure on this, just so I can make sure it stays into position like so. Now obviously what that now gives me is a beautiful clean edge that you can see, really nice. You can really see the end grain pattern that we're going to end up with shining through. And because we're relying on the accuracy of the MFT grid, it should be perfectly 90 degrees, and look at that, absolutely is. Now my overall board width at this moment is 297. Now my planer jointer will give me a maximum cut of 254 millimeters. So I need to take 254 off the 297, divide that by 2, and that's how much I need to come in on each side. So 297 minus 254 equals 43, divided by 2 equals 21.5. So we're going to come in 22 millimeters on either side, and 22 millimeters is going to be there. So measuring between those two, just for this check, should be 254 and give or take a ½ millimeter. It is. So I now can use this end here that we've just cut as a reference end on a square, and now I can put my table in rip cut configuration to make the next cut. So I just want to make sure I'm super square. Obviously I've not got a huge amount of reference material against this fence, so I'll push that up to the fence. I want to make sure that my cut mark, that one we made here, is where it needs to be on that plastic strip. I just want to take that measurement and lock it into my set square like so. And now I can line this up just to make sure we're looking good and parallel all the way down here. And that's looking pretty good there. Now I just want to put some light clamping pressure on this to lock it into place. And I'm confident to go ahead and make this cut. Everything's tight, everything's clamped down. Good, let's do this. Now we can see how we did. We were looking for 254 and we've got 254 at that end and 254 at that end, and one assumes 254 in the middle. So we've got this down to a position now where this will go through the planer thicknesser. So all I'm going to do is to run this through the planer thicknesser a couple of times, taking it down no more than 0.5 millimeter each time. I don't really want to reduce the thickness of this, but I do want to get it all flat ready for the next stage of jointing. So I'll run that through the planer thicknesser 0.5 millimeter at a time till it's all nice and clean. Both sides of the board will come back together and look at the next step. Now my design of board allows for 20 strips, each 40 millimeters wide. So a 40 millimeter strip taken from here, on its end, is going to give me a 40 millimeter thick board. And 40 millimeters, as you can see, is a substantial board. Now the overall length of the board is going to be dictated by the thickness of this. Now we know that this is nominally now around about 20 millimeters thick, bit less, about 19, but call it 20. So if I was to take 20 strips down this board, 20 times 20 is 400, and we were looking for a 400 long board. So our board is going to be 400 long, and it's going to be 4 thick, which is a really sturdy board. So I'm quite pleased with that. So obviously I want all these to be exactly the same size. Any variance in this we can sort out later, but it will have variances in the thickness of the top. So the more accurate we can cut these, the better off we're going to be. I'm going to again use my track saw. I'm going to measure a 40 millimeter strip, and then I'm going to put a stop here. So in theory I can slide up to the stop, make my cut, slide up to the stop, make my cut, and repeat that throughout the length of the board. Now I'm going to set my sliding square to give me the cut I want here, and we know that the overall thickness is going to be 40 millimeters. But don't forget, I'm using the outside of the curve cut, not the cut against this line here. So I actually want to allow for the thickness of the blade, and on Festool blades that's 2.2 millimeters. So I'm going to set this for round about 42 and a bit. I can now slide my board forward, and that there is the position I want to make my cut, and that should allow for the blade. So I now want to put a stop here, and something like that should do the job. Obviously you don't have to use something like this, I just had it to hand in the shop, but I could have used the short fence that we used. I could have used a scrap of wood, just so I've got that available, and it's substantial. So in theory I can now come along up to that, make my cut, slide up the next one, make my cut. Right, what we end up with these strips, and now we just want to organise these so we get that checkboard pattern I'm looking for, which is something like that. And if your cutting's been reasonably okay, then you're in good shape, and these should all be pretty much the same thickness. Now I do have variance. I mean, this one here is higher than this one here, this one's higher than this one, but the thing that's concerned me the most about where we're up to now is this burning. As I've been going through the wood, you can start to see that every now and then I've got this burn mark here, and this one here is particularly deep. So what we now need to do is to sand that out. So to help me with the next stage, the sanding process, I'm going to work on one side of this. So everything on a flat surface, i.e. the MFT, I'm going to use these clamps just to line this up in this direction. I just put a little bit of clamping pressure on these. So my next job is I'm going to go and sand it flat. I'm going to sand it so all these burn marks are actually going to come out of the wood. Everything lies flat, so I can look at these joints overall, and then we can look at the next stage. Now, to get this down to where I want it to be, I think it's going to take me a fair few hours of hand sanding. So I'm going to get that done, and in the next episode we'll come back together, we'll get this thing glued up. I want to put the juice groove around the outside, a couple of handles so it's easy to lift up and down, and then put the final coat of finish on it. So stick with me, come back on the next episode and we'll look at that. I'll see you soon.